You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about the Boneyard with the torture bunker and the most evil killer duo to exist. If you believe you've heard of the most evil people in the world, you'll be rethinking that after you learn about these killers. From childhood to arrest, no amount of sadistic events were enough for these two. As the victims piled up and the torture increased, they had the perfect place where no one would hear the screams. If you don't know, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories. I mean, no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if that's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. I also want to thank our sponsor, ThredUp. You sweet souls will often ask me where I get my outfits or my jewelry, and the truth is, most of them are thrifted, so I can't necessarily give you a link to purchase, but I kind of found the next best thing. You see, when ThredUp contacted me, I thought it was absolutely perfect because it is an online thrift store, and so while you can't get the same exact pieces, you can find ones that maybe you will love more, maybe it's more your style, because not only is it more sustainable, it's also better for your wallet, and it allows you to have unique pieces that will last, that aren't just trendy and will fall apart on you in a year, but you can still also find comparisons to those trendy pieces if that's what you like. But I wanted to get some ThredUp pieces that were more for spring. Here in Kansas, it can either be really hot or kind of cold in the spring. You never really know. So I have a mixture of a whole bunch of different pieces in here that I got and I tried on for you, and I absolutely love it. Now, this dress from Calvin Klein was actually originally $139, but on ThredUp, it was selling for only $36.99. I couldn't believe it was such a good deal for such high quality. And then this Everlane wool pullover sweater that I've been searching for forever was originally $98, and I bought it for $44.99. This is literally going to be my favorite website. I'm going to be shopping here all the time, and I got you guys 30% off your first order with free shipping, and you just had to put in code BROOKE30. So if you want 30% off your first order with free shipping, go and add the code BROOKE30. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1984 in California, and the Dubs family lived in San Francisco. This was Harvey and Deborah and their one-year-old son, Sean. Now, Harvey worked for a printing company and would also film special events like weddings and rent out his equipment for extra money on the side to keep the family afloat. They were a cute little family, but this isn't a happy story. The entire family vanished from their home on July 24th, and it was believed to be an abduction. A neighbor found keys in the door and dirty dishes, but no one was there, and no one ever came to work or to daycare or to the grocery store ever again. When investigators began to talk to possible witnesses, they found that someone had seen a small Asian man leaving the home carrying a duffel bag and another large bag with him. And then he got into a truck that was actually waiting outside for him with another man in the driver's seat. He was this burly, bearded man. Now, this made investigators think back to another crime that had happened just 13 days prior, still in San Francisco. This was actually on July 11th, where a 36-year-old named Donald Gouletti was in his apartment with his roommate, Richard Kazara. Donald was actually this openly gay man. He was a radio personality, and that night he would actually be shot in his head at the door when he answered the door. And Richard was shot in the chest in the back room. Now, Richard actually survived and was able to call 911, and when they arrived, he told them that Donald would often put his, ad in the paper, his phone number, his address, to have different straight men come to his door for different things that they could possibly want from a gay man. And so they believed that this is why the person had come to the door. But as far as the description, Richard was able to give them one. He described him as a small Chinese man with glasses. With a murder, an attempted murder, and 3 disappearances all happening within such a close timeline in the same area, investigators believed they were looking for the same man. Yet there was no evidence to link all of them, and all they could do was wait. And unfortunately, that would be for another attack or another disappearance. 3 months later, in October, it would come. This was 34-year-old Randy Jacobson, who left to sell his van to a man that his girlfriend had claimed wanted her to come with him to work at a marijuana plantation. She had denied, but her boyfriend Randy still wanted to sell his van to this man, and so he went to sell the van and never returned. Then on November 2nd, 39-year-old Paul Cosner didn't come home, and his girlfriend couldn't get a hold of him, neither could his sister, so they filed a missing persons report. And investigators found he too was trying to sell his car in the local paper. His sister actually knew that a big burly man had taken the car to test drive, and then later on he called and said, okay, I want the car, and that is when Paul left, but he didn't come home from selling the car. This was yet another connection to someone being on a crime spree, possibly a duo. 2 months later, so it was now 1985, another man would vanish. He was only 24 years old, and he was named Cliff Parenteau. He worked at a moving company. He would often go to the local bar after work with coworkers, and he was seen that weekend partying and just having the time of his life. He actually didn't make it to the work shift that he was supposed to that weekend, but people saw him partying, and so he was okay. But he had actually won a lottery ticket for about $250. So they figured he was celebrating, he wasn't going to come in that day. However, he never actually returned to his job, and so investigators had talked to the bartender who was there, and he had told them that Cliff had left with his friend, who seemed to be his friend, who was an Asian man. Now, strangely enough, 2 weeks later, a letter was actually sent from Cliff to his boss stating he had a new job and would not be coming back. It also said an address that his last check could be sent to. That seemed to answer all the questions. There was nothing too suspicious about this. People change jobs all the time, except that another employee from this moving company named Jeff Gerald would say the same thing. He would vanish, and then he would say he got another job and needed the check at the same address, and this was a little more than a month later on February 23rd. Again, it was believed possibly Cliff had contacted Jeff and said, look, this job is much better. Come down here and we can figure it out from there. So investigators weren't too worried about this. So these strange circumstances weren't necessarily enough for investigators to waste resources tracking these men down when they could have just possibly changed jobs, especially when 2 months later they had more disappearances on their hands that appeared to be much more sinister. You see, on April 12th, 23-year-old Michael Carroll and his 18-year-old girlfriend Kathleen Allen vanished as well. Now, at first, it was just Michael. They were both staying in a motel around that time, and 10 days prior, Michael had actually left and hadn't come back. So Kathleen kept going to work, worried about her boyfriend, but then she actually got a call from him saying that he had actually been shot while he was down there, and he was sending someone to pick her up to take her to him. So she asked her boss if she could have some time off, and she ended up getting into this car with the friend of Michael's, and they both were never found again. Now, investigators were able to track down her last movements, which were in the parking lot of the job where she got into a car with what her boss said was a bearded man. Now, although there were many different witnesses either saying a bearded man or an Asian man, those weren't necessarily extremely unique things to say about someone. And so it left them with witnesses who were relieved they had seen something, but not able to really get them a name. And all of these cases were happening in San Francisco within 10 months, 8 missing persons, 1 murder victim, and 1 survivor. all with very small connections to one another. Besides Cliff and Jeff and the family, no one really knew each other. But that wouldn't be all. Only 7 days later, 26-year-old Robert Stapley would go on vacation away from his San Francisco home. He always went to stay with his friends, who were the Bonds. Now, this was Lonnie, Brenda, and their 2-year-old son, Lonnie Jr. Now, they lived in the more secluded area in the beautiful mountains in Wilseyville, California. But he never returned home like he was supposed to, and friends and family told investigators where he had been, and that's when things became more serious. This wasn't just because there were more victims and another whole entire family missing. This was because the man that they hoped to mark off their list of victims, Cliff and Gerald, who had just vanished, may have been victims after all. You see, Wilseyville, California was where their checks were meant to be sent to. Was this an odd coincidence or their first clue as to what was going on? By this point, descriptions were sent out from all the witnesses that had possibly seen these killers to the San Francisco public to be on the lookout for these two men who were on a crime spree and possibly killers. But then investigators finally caught a break. The police had randomly been called to a robbery in progress at a South City lumber store in San Francisco. And this was actually 2 months after the last disappearances of the Bond family. So on June 2nd, this employee at the store had no idea that they had actually just caught a killer. They were more worried about a $75 vice that this man had put under his jacket and ran out of the store with. Now, an off-duty police officer just happened to be nearby and was able to kind of stop and look around the parking lot, and that's when he saw this small Asian man running after he threw something in this Honda car. And so instead of running after this man, he decided to stay and look in the car, even though he knew that the descriptions did kind of look like this man, but they figured there might be some evidence here in this car that he obviously was the owner of or was driving around. He also called for backup, saying that it could possibly be the man they were looking for. When the rest of the officers arrived, they did find that $75 vice that he had stolen from the lumberyard, but they also found a pistol as well as a silencer, which was illegal. And just when they thought that they had let a killer go, that is when another man walked into the parking lot claiming the vehicle and saying he was going to pay for that vice. He said his name was Robert Stapley, showed them his ID, but not only did this ID not look anything like this man that they were looking at, it was also the name of one of their missing persons. But the man that they were looking at was a burly, bearded man. And so with him knowing a small Asian man, they decided to take him into custody as being one of these two abductors. It was soon revealed that the car that the two of them were driving didn't belong to either of them. It was registered to Paul Cosner, another one of the men who had vanished after selling his car. But the license plate was actually registered to someone else, and he too was missing. This was Lonnie Bond. Now, the burly bearded man who had identified himself as Robert Stapley, and they said, "There's no way that you are him, tell us the truth." He did not continue lying for long. He actually identified himself as a man named Leonard Lake, and he also began to cry. Now, he was then naming another man who was his accomplice named Charles Ng. He said he had not done this alone, but what exactly was he referring to? What had they done? Well, Leonard seemed to be talking, and so when he asked for a glass of water and a pencil and paper to write something down, they did agree. They thought it would be a confession. However, he had told them, "No, I'm just writing a letter to my ex-wife." So they did leave the room, and that is when they would give him some time, and then they re-entered to find him seizing on the floor. He was not responsive, and when they combed through the footage of what he was doing in there, he actually reached up in the collar of his jacket and brought something out that appeared to be a pill and took it. As soon as he took it, his eyes rolled back, he began gagging and seizing, and he was rushed to the hospital. But he was the only witness of these disappearances, and they were on the verge of losing him. At the hospital, it was determined that he had taken a cyanide pill, and he was not looking very good. He was in a coma and they didn't know if he would ever make it out. Investigators read this note that was to his ex-wife. It was more like a suicide note. It read, "Dear Lynn, I love you and forgive you. Freedom is better than all else. I'm sorry. Mom, Patty, and all, I'm sorry for all the trouble." Meanwhile, the car that they had found with these two men was being looked through with a fine-tooth comb, and that is when they found that there was not only blood spatter in the car, there was also a gunshot wound in the roof, and there was a stun gun and bullets. And that is when they found a piece of paper. And it didn't seem like it mattered that much. However, it had one of the answers that they desperately needed. You see, it was a utility bill that was registered to a woman named Claralyn Balazs. And she wasn't one of the missing people. But the address on it was in California in the Wilseyville area. They also believed that Carolyn could be shortened to Lynn, and was the woman that Leonard had written this letter to. She was his ex-wife. Now, this address was where the Bond family had vanished from, and two of the other missing men had wanted their checks to be sent to. And so investigators reached out to Claralyn asking if she would allow this cabin to be searched. And she was more than willing to. However, she said it was very remote, and so they should probably have someone who actually knew the area to find it, not get confused. So she agreed to meet with them the next morning to take them there. And they said, okay, please do not go there. We need to look at it with fresh eyes. Nothing needs to be moved. She agreed. And the next day, when she was supposed to meet them, she was actually late. And that is when she admitted that she and Leonard Lake's mother had gone to the cabin to clean up because it was messy. I also saw one source that said she wanted to get out the nude videos of her that he had taken before they got there. They told her if she removed any evidence, she was obstructing justice, and she denied doing this. But 4 days later, Leonard Lake was dead. And while investigators headed out to search the property, more was uncovered about who Leonard really was. Back to his childhood. He was actually born in the San Francisco area on October 29th, 1949, which would have made him 40 years old. He was said to be very strange from the beginning. His parents had divorced when he was young, and he went to live with his grandparents, but even as a child, he was showing signs of sadism, of torture. He began dissolving mice in chemicals to kill them. And then he began taking nude photos of his sisters and would use it as blackmail against them. When he was 19, he joined the Marines, and during his first tour in Vietnam, he was actually hospitalized for psychotic reactions, although this didn't stop them from sending him back into the war. So when he was 26, he had a mental breakdown that sent him back to the US and admitted to a psych ward. There, he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder and was medically discharged. Now, Leonard attempted to go to college after this, but soon dropped out and joined a hippie community. Now, while there, he became more of a survivalist and had an obsession with guns and a possible global nuclear war. Then he found his first wife, they married, they settled down, but when she found him making sexually explicit films, she ended up divorcing him, and he was also kicked out of the hippie community. From there, his new home would be prison for a while because he was caught stealing a car, but when he got out, he went to another hippie settlement in California where he met Claralyn, whom he called Cricket. Now, after talking to Claralyn, and she allowed them to search the cabin, they also got a bit more information from her about their marriage, and she said that her ex-husband was often making sexually explicit films, but she actually joined him in this. There was also a rumor that she had gotten fired from her job as a teacher's aide at the local high school because she was teaching kids how to make explosives. But then she was taken to trial, and she told the judge that she thought it would come in handy for the kids because they could blow tree stumps for land clearing. So she was then released. The cabin that was so secluded in the mountains was her family's property. They had had it for years. They were going to use it as a retirement home, but then they ended up renting it to the couple. But nobody had really lived in it in quite some time. Investigators believe that this could have been the place where killings had occurred, but also where before this, Leonard had hid out from a warrant for his arrest, which had occurred back in 1982, 2 years before the disappearances began. Both he and Charles Ng were arrested for firearm violations, and Leonard made bail and then vanished. Charles did have to spend several years in prison at that point. So where and how did Charles become part of this? When did he come into the picture? Well, it appeared as though he was supposed to be a victim himself. You see, when investigators arrived at this remote cabin, they found what they described as a compound for killing. There was what appeared to be a survivalist bunker, which was away from the house just enough, but still close enough to watch. This place was too far from civilization for anyone to hear anyone's screams. And when the cabin was being looked through, they found no survivors, but they were finding some evidence. They asked if they could look into this bunker, this shed, whatever it was on the property. And Clara Lynn actually said she didn't have the keys and that wouldn't be a good idea. In the cabin, they actually found video equipment from the Dubs family, vehicles from the Bonds, an ID from Michael Carroll. They were finding evidence that the victims had been here. Eventually, they were able to get back to the property with a search warrant for the cabin and the bunker. And there were no survivors inside the bunker either. When you first looked inside, it had a false front as a tool shed. There were many different tools on the walls, all believed to be covered in blood. It was made of cinder blocks, but inside it appeared to be the makings of a torture bunker. There were tools, there were handcuffs, there was clothing, makeup, and a book called The Collector, which is about a man who abducts a woman as his slave, hoping that she would fall in love with him. There were posters on the wall of photos of 21 women. And then there was also a list of rules that these women had to follow. Like, don't look the men in the eyes and don't speak unless spoken to. Investigators knew of only 3 women at this point, who were Deborah Dubs, Kathleen Allen, and Brenda Bond. But there were many more photos in there. That wasn't all that was in this torture bunker, though, because there was also this hidden small cell with no windows and a small mattress and a bucket for a toilet inside. That's when they found videos of these women being tortured. They were labeled M ladies. The evidence was overwhelming, yet the women that they had been watching being tortured couldn't be identified until they got to Kathleen Allen. Footage showed her forced to dress up, pose, and then sexually assaulted by these men. That is when the digging on the property began, because they believed that these victims had been murdered and were still there. They were correct, because 45 pounds of human remains were found in that yard, many who had been tortured, burned, and dismembered, including infants. Most were going to be hard to identify, but they did find 2 full bodies stacked on top of each other in a shallow grave, and they were able to identify these 2 as 2 of the missing they already knew about, Lonnie Bond and Robert Stapley, the ones who had been living together at that time when Robert was vacationing. This gave them a good idea that anyone previously connected to these 2 men were most likely in what they could refer to as the Boneyard, or they could be found in the incinerator that they had located next to the bunker. Everywhere the investigators walked, they were worried about stepping on remains, and the computers were struggling to keep up with all of this evidence at this time. But then they found a hand-drawn map that led to 5-gallon buckets that were buried. And inside of these buckets were 25 names and IDs, as well as journals and more videotapes. On the videotapes, not only was it more torture of Kathleen Allen, but it was also torture of Deborah Dubs and Brenda, who was in the Bond family but went by Brenda O'Connor. Leonard and Charles were seen torturing them. Charles had cut off Brenda's shirt with a knife and told her, "You can cry and stuff like the rest of them, but it won't do any good. We're pretty cold-hearted, so to speak." Brenda then asked what had happened to her baby, who had disappeared the same day she had, and Leonard told her that the baby is sound asleep, like a rock. In another one, Leonard told Kathleen, "If you don't go along with us, we'll probably take you into bed, tie you down, rape you, shoot you, and bury you." Deborah wasn't even spoken to at all. She was just beaten to death. Charles told another victim, What I want is an off-the-shelf sex partner. I want to be able to use a woman any way I want, and when I'm bored, I want to be able to simply put her away. Investigators knew that someone needed to be arrested for this, justice needed to be given, and now they only had one option for that, or so they thought, and so they had to find Charles Ng immediately. So they started with his childhood. They began to work backwards, and they were searching for where he possibly would run to. He was born in British Hong Kong to a very wealthy family, and he was the youngest of 3. He was said to be beaten by his father by a cane when he misbehaved, and from there he kind of went to not wanting to do work at school. He was expelled from multiple schools. He would set fires and he would steal, and he ended up being able to come to the States on a student visa in college, but ended up dropping out, just like Leonard. Although it was allegedly because he got into a hit-and-run accident and wanted to flee. So to avoid being arrested, Charles then entered the Marines as well, while not being a citizen. He told them he was from Indiana, and no one questioned it, so he trained as a gunner. While enlisted, Charles was said to become obsessed with violence and guns and fighting everybody. And, he once told a coworker, "No gun, no fun, no kill, no thrill. Daddy dies, mommy cries, baby fries." They all called him Bruce Lee, but avoided him completely. It wasn't a funny nickname. It was almost as if they were trying to save themselves. Eventually, he was court-martialed for stealing automatic weapons, and while in custody, he had told them that he had assassinated someone before, and he laced salt shakers in the Marines' mess hall with cyanide. That wasn't all. He then confessed that he also fired a grenade at a staff sergeant and was upset when it was a dud. But before he could be sentenced, he escaped, and this is allegedly when Charles and Leonard met, because Leonard had been living in this remote cabin with his wife, but he wanted more. And what I didn't tell you is that we only knew of 13 people who had vanished, and they believed there was 25 at least. So where did these other people come from? There was also a man named Donald Lake who had been killed before this killing spree started. That's right, Leonard's own brother. Younger brother. Leonard had often told his mother that the world was better off without Donald. So after Donald came to work for Leonard, the mother was very worried that something had happened, and she had the right to be. There was also Leonard's friend, Charles Gunner, who was the best man at his wedding, who he killed as well. Leonard had begun killing and was ready for another victim. He had put an ad in Wargamers magazine, and that is when Charles answered. But when Charles arrived, they realized that they were insanely similar and perfect partners. That's when Leonard showed him around the property that would become the Boneyard and the torture bunker. And that is when Charles began living with Leonard and Carolyn, his wife, who lived in a mobile home away from the cabin. That is where the next year they would be arrested for having so many illegal firearms, and Leonard went into hiding, Charles went to jail. But in 1984, he was paroled and the two got back together. And during this time away from each other, Leonard had built this bunker that he called a dungeon. You see, he had tried to build a survivalist bunker before when he was at the hippie community to survive the incoming nuclear holocaust, but they didn't let him. And so now on this property he was renting, but really he owned with his wife, no one was stopping him. The journals that were found show that he wrote about an Operation Miranda to turn his bunker into a physical setting for his sexual fantasies, security for himself and his possessions. It was also limited protection for a nuclear fallout. But Operation Miranda was named after the Miranda who is in the book The Collector, who was the slave of the man who abducted her. He also wrote in this journal, God meant women for cooking, cleaning house, and sex, and when they are not in use, they should be locked up. He also wrote, if you love something, let it go. If it doesn't come back, hunt it down and kill it. Now, July 11th of 1984, the murders began. Leonard and Charles would pick random victims. They would bring them back to this cabin where they would kill the men, the children, and then they would take the women to torture and put them in this bunker. Leonard would get rid of the bodies just how he used to kill mice as a child, by dissolving them in chemicals or burying them on the property and dismembering them. They would steal the identities of these men and use them to get different loans to continue building on to this torture bunker. But not all the victims were complete strangers. You see, Cliff and Jeff, the ones who had been working for the moving company and suddenly decided to get a new job. At that moving company, they were working with Charles Ng. He also had a job there and was working with them before they vanished. Michael Carroll was actually a drug leader, allegedly, and was said to be a cellmate with Charles when he was in jail at one point. The Bond family, which was Brenda, Lonnie, and Lonnie Jr., as well as Robert Stapley, who was staying with them, all lived right next door to the Boneyard. They would often get upset at how bad of neighbors Leonard was, and they also believed they had seen him bury a body in the woods. They tried to stay away from him, but that weekend Lonnie had actually gone over to talk to them about everything, and that's when they were all murdered. Now, while Leonard had died, his partner in crime, Charles Ng, was caught after 34 excruciating days of hunting him down. Investigators had actually tracked him to Canada by friends because Leonard's ex-wife finally told investigators that Charles had come to her and had asked her to take him to the San Francisco's International Airport because he needed to leave town. He then went to Chicago under the alias Mike Komoto and found a friend to drive him to Canada. No one had caught him yet, but witnesses had said that they had seen him in the bus station shaving off his sideburns and his eyebrows. But they would soon have him when a call claiming a robbery at a department store was in progress. When the police arrived, a security guard had already been shot in the hand, and Charles Ng was in custody, being held by different members of the store, just shoppers who had come and helped the security guard. And so he was being brought down to custody, and he was sentenced to 4.5 years for these crimes in Canada. And the San Francisco investigators then heard who had been captured. They immediately wanted to extradite back to California, but Canada refused because they no longer had the death penalty, and they knew that if they were sending him back to the US, he would most likely be put to death. Charles was admitting at this point that he was Leonard's accomplice, but all he did was dispose of the bodies. For 6 long years, he stayed in Canada, and then the Supreme Court of Canada voted 4-3 against him to send him back, and he was deported 18 minutes later. Once back in California, though, his trial wasn't for another 7 years. So finally, on October 26th of 1998, he was brought to trial, and his lawyer claimed that he had witnessed the crimes. He had been with Leonard, but he had not killed or buried anyone. His lawyer was trying to say that Charles was an angel, but he was charged with murder, and he wasn't ending lives, he was just cutting clothes off. Meanwhile, Charles had been caught in prison with escape materials and had removed 3 judges before this one. He continued to fire his team. He went through 10 different lawyers and was trying to delay the trial as much as possible. After this, he decided he was going to represent himself. Then he asked for his lawyer, who was named Kelly, back, and the judge denied this, and that is when Charles filed a complaint, and then he had to let him have the lawyer back. That is when he decided he wanted to represent himself again, but everyone was done with the games at this point and refused to let him keep going. And so his last-ditch effort was to begin cursing and yelling at the judge and trying to kind of rage in court. His lawyers turned this, though, and said this is just proof of his mental illness. He was being kept in a separate cage while not being in court because he couldn't be in the same cells as regular prisoners. At the time of his outburst in court, they actually put an electric stun gun belt on him so that anytime he acted up, the bailiff could make it go off. For 8 months, this trial went on, and Leonard's ex-wife, Clara Lynn, was set to testify, but suddenly Charles' lawyer dismissed her without asking any questions. The jurors were then shown cartoon drawings made by Charles while in prison of women being tortured, abused, and burnt. Psychiatrist Stuart Grayson said that he believed that Charles had a dependent personality disorder, or he heavily depended on others. Yet, after seeing the tapes of what he did on the M ladies and the torture that he put his victims through, it showed that Charles was not only involved, he was heavily enjoying what he did. The psychiatrist then came forward saying, I've never seen the tapes before, that's why I said that he was just a dependent person. But another psychologist said that Charles was only mirroring Leonard's behavior in the tapes. And so it made some believe maybe he was just the accomplice and not part of a duo. Now, Charles' parents actually came and took the stand as well, and his father took part of the blame, saying that he had enforced severe punishment on his son as a child because he believed it would make him a better citizen, and he apologized for that. But just like we often talk about, many people go through horrific childhoods and they don't turn to this. But as the trial came to a close, Charles yet again tried to delay it. He got a phone number for one of the jurors and tried to call them at their home. Thankfully, this was unsuccessful, so it was not a mistrial. They did not have to go through the entire process again. So on February of 1999, after 15 hours of deliberation, Charles was found guilty of killing all but one. They could only get evidence on 12 or 13, I guess, of the victims, but he was only found guilty of 12. The one victim he wasn't charged with was Paul Cosners, the man who had disappeared while selling his car. This was the same car they were seen driving, and they found his ID as well, but for whatever reason, he was not sentenced to his murder. And Charles was then sentenced to death. The judge was then asked why he would not reduce it to a life sentence, and he said Mr. Ng was not under any duress, nor does the evidence support that he was under the domination of Leonard Lake. Investigators did agree, saying that they believed that both Leonard and Charles were both psychopaths, but Leonard was just more goal-oriented, which made him, do more of the things and, build the bunker and all of that. But Charles went along with him not because he had to, but because he had the urge to kill and torture as well. Charles' trial ended up being the most expensive trial in California history at $20 million. Now, 6 of the M ladies on these tapes were actually found to still be alive. I wasn't able to find any survivor stories, and I don't know how they got away, but 15 of them are still missing and unidentified from the videotapes. Now, some of the victims who were remaining on the property were said to be friends and family of the prior victims who went to find their loved ones and were murdered as well. But 15 photos were actually shown to the public in hopes that somebody would come forward to identify them. And 2 victims have been named as 26-year-old Cheryl Okora and 38-year-old Maurice Walk. Both had been invited onto this farm by Leonard and were never seen again. Now, Charles now resides at the San Quentin State Prison on death row and is going to stay there for the rest of his life, as California hasn't executed anyone since 2006. How do you think these 2 got away with it for so long? It wasn't a long period. It was just 2 years, but there were so many victims, so close. It seems like a case that would have been solved sooner. And just like with all killer duos, we ask, would they have done it if they weren't together? With this one, I believe that they would have. I think that with them being together, it only doubled the amount of victims and the amount of torture they could ensue. But I think that they still would have both escalated to becoming killers at some point. And also, why do you think they went for such difficult victims? Whole families, strong men. Most serial killers, we see that they abduct victims who won't be missed or who they don't think would be missed. Something like a sex worker or someone who lives alone and has no family. Yet they went for the hard ones. Was this misplaced confidence? Was this ignorance? Was this the fact that they could give them false trust? I'd love to know what you think. This case is by far one of the worst I have ever researched. These 2 men were horrific, and I guarantee you they are more evil than anyone you have ever heard about. If not, let me know down below, and maybe I can do a case on who you think is the most evil killer out there. And also remember, you can get 30% off your first order on ThreadUp with the code Brooke30. But don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay,